really small on this pattern. This is going to be a micro Baetis or Mayfly nymph, and it's very small. This is an incredibly effective pattern. But because I'm tying it small, we're going to tie this one on a size 20, I think is what I've got here, in a 5/64 copper bead on here. Not a lot of materials here, and if you're going to tie small, this is actually a good one to learn to tie small with, because it's pretty straightforward, and it's not overly difficult. For thread, I'm going to use the yellow. And here I'm using a Nano Silk Yellow 18/aught. And I'm just going to go ahead and get that started behind the bead here. I'm not overly concerned with bulk on this one, especially not up near the bead, because we're going to be kind of tapering this forward. So once I've got my thread secure here, we're going to tie in our first material, and I like to use Coq de Leon here. These fibers just make an awesome tail. We're going to have a relatively short and stiff tail here, so this is the Coq de Leon. I'm going to strip some fibers off, and we're going to tie those in next. So in my fingers I've got the Coq de Leon fibers, and I've got them pretty lined up. We're going to go ahead and tie them on the top of the hook shank here with a couple of thread wraps. And I'm not too concerned about length at this point. I'm more concerned about getting those on the top of the hook, because those certainly are way too long. But I've left this piece here, which will allow me to grab hold of all of those fibers here and just kind of draw the material backwards until I get the tails to the length that I want them, which will be about that size. And once I get there, I'm going to go ahead and do some more thread wraps and kind of crank down on them even, just to kind of hold those fibers in place. And again, it's a small hook, so I don't want to take like 50,000 wraps here, but enough that I can grab hold of these now and snip the butt ends off without shortening the tail at all. But one thing that I do like to do with this is, aside from the thread, in terms of bulk material, we're going to use some stretch tubing. I like to get that kind of tied down, both of those materials tied in on this pattern fairly early in the process. And I do that because we're using this yellow thread, because it's going to kind of shine through the stretch tubing. So I want as much of that yellow showing through as I possibly can. So if I can put some materials on right up front, then I can take more wraps back up and down the shank of the hook and get more of that yellow color kind of shining through. So for the body, we're going to just use some stretch micro tubing. I'm going to use an olive color here. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this stretch tubing that's now secured to the hook, towards the bend of the hook, the very end of the material. This is the piece that we're going to cut off, is going to be up here, and I'm going to kind of pull on it a little bit, because we're going to want to stretch this material out, which will give us less bulk as we move back towards the back end of this fly. And the material is pretty forgiving, so you can pull on it pretty hard without it breaking, and get it much thinner here towards the back end of the hook. And then we'll move back up towards the front end of the hook now that we've got that secured and in place. I'm trying to learn, more and more ways to do things that I don't have to fight things as much, and this is one way, especially with such a small hook, and I'm getting a little bit older, so it's harder to see. So I'm actually going to use tweezers, and I'm just going to grab hold of the stretch tubing up here at the top with my tweezers, and I'm going to pull upwards while I come in with my scissors. So there you can see that butt end, and we're just going to throw that. So now that I've got those two materials tied in, that's why I wanted to tie them in early, because I do want to take a couple of passes back and forth here just to have this yellow color shine through a little bit. Let my thread hang. I'm going to grab hold of my stretch tubing now, And I'm going to take this and be careful around the point of the hook. I'm going to pull this fairly tight as I make my first wrap here at the back end. And when you're tying with this stretch material, one of the cool things is with each turn, what I do is I loosen it up I lessen the tension just a little bit. And what that does is creates a bigger band, creating that tapering effect, actually using this micro tubing. So that just takes a little bit of time and patience to kind of learn or figure how to do that out. But I'm going to tie this micro tubing right up to the bead here like that. Then I'm going to take my thread and we're going to capture that just by throwing a couple of thread wraps over it while this material is heading towards the eye of the hook, which means my thread is tying over the top of the material. So once I've got that taken care of, really, for all intents and purposes, we're done with the fly. I'm going to pull that micro tubing tight as I clip it, and that will have the rest of it kind of the elastic pull back down into the thread wraps there. I have a lot left over. I used a lot more than I needed, but that's because I'm going to tie probably 3 or 4 or 5 more of these flies. So from here, all I'm going to do is we're going to finish up right here at the collar of the fly. And then I'm going to give myself a little bit of extra thread so that we can throw in our whip finish. So I'm going to grab my whip finisher here, and we're kind of good to go with that. Just take 3 or 4 whip finish turns here. Again, trying to avoid bulk. But we're going to do a few extra things to this before we're finished with it. But again, I mean, we're out of the danger zone at this point. So we have our fly, our micro Baetis, kind of looking like this. It kind of looks a lot like a perdigon, very similar to a perdigon pattern. What I'll do when I finish this fly off is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to throw some color on the top of the micro tubing here. So I'm just going to grab a marker here, and this is kind of a pumpkin orange. It's not going to look pumpkin orange by a long shot, but I'm going to go ahead and put some of that on the copper bead here. But I just want this on the top of the fly. I don't want it on the bottom. I just want this a little bit of on the top here. And what that does is it creates a fly where the bottom, the belly of it, is a lighter olive, and the top is the darker color. Now from here, I'm just going to grab some, I'm going to use UV. I'm going to use a Loon UV Clear. And we're not going to need a whole bunch of this because this is just going to go along the top of the fly here. And I've got my UV light ready to go. I'm going to just dab just a tiny little bit here on the bead itself. I'm going to clean off my needle here, and then I'm going to just drag some of that UV back, trying to keep it just on the top of the hook, and then I'm going to hit it with my UV light, and that will firm that up. But that shell that we're looking for just on the top of the fly, it's also going to make it a little bit more durable. So those thread wraps that we used there at the very end for our collar with the whip finish, they're going to stay in place they're locked in place now with this UV. So this is much more durable at this point. And with that, we're really done with the fly. Again, this is an incredibly productive pattern. It is tied small, obviously, because it's called a micro Baetis.